ここからが君の本当の旅だ。
お前には俺たちがついてる。もう呼ぶんじゃねえぞ。俺は超忙しいんだ。
So get your face ready.
So, I just finished my journey through Kamen Rider Decade, and I wanted to share with you guys my thoughts on the series, the movies, and the bizarre state it was left in by the end of it. But first of all, why did I rewatch Kamen Rider Decade in 2024? Was it for the 15th anniversary? No, that was more of just a coincidence. I started Tokusatsu in 2010 with Go Onger, once Power Rangers was off the air. I then moved on to Shinkenger, and then eventually Gokaiger. I started Kamen Rider in 2011 thanks to a lot of Tokusatsu content creators at the time who were getting me more interested in the franchise. Kamen Rider Forze was the current show on at the air, and I had seen a couple scenes of Kamen Rider O's, but my first real series that I had watched through to completion was Kamen Rider Den-O. Now, I had watched 2 episodes of Kamen Rider prior to this. The Shinkenger crossover 2-parter of Kamen Rider Decade were the first 2 episodes of Kamen Rider that I had ever watched. I had to figure out what happened to Ika-chan after all.
通りすがりの仮面ライダーってとこかな。はあ、仮面ライダー？なんじゃそりゃ！待て！イカちゃん返せライダーやろ！
So in 2011, I watched through all of Kamen Rider Den-O. I finished it, I fell in love with it. I avoided the Cho Den-O movies based on what I had heard about them, and so I moved on to Kamen Rider Kiva and Kamen Rider Decade. I watched through both shows at a breakneck pace. By the time Wizard was in its midpoint, I think I was caught up all in that era of Kamen Rider. So fast forward to 2019. Kamen Rider Go is on the air, and I'm watching it. I'm not really feeling it. I got up to the Ryuki episode, and I decided to finish what I needed to finish, which is watching the rest of the Heisei Kamen Rider seasons. I had watched Ryuki, Faiz, and every Kamen Rider season from Kamen Rider Den-O through Kamen Rider Build. Yes, all of them. So over the last few years, I watched Kuga, Agito, Blade, Hibiki, and Kabuto. All seasons which I had luckily managed to avoid watching the tribute episodes of in Kamen Rider Go. By the time I was caught up, it was 2022, we were already into the Reiwa era. Once I had realized it had been over a decade since I had first seen my original Rider seasons, I decided to do a rewatch for the first time, which for me, doing rewatches isn't something I usually do, so it was kind of a big deal. So I rewatched Gokaiger. Because I decided I was going to do a video retrospective on Power Rangers Megaforce. Still working on it. But I also decided I wanted to go back and rewatch Kamen Rider Den-O. First because it was my first Kamen Rider series, of course, and secondly because I wanted to go and I wanted to check off all those Cho Den-O movies that I had just avoided up until this time. And so I figured I would watch Den-O, I would watch Decade, I would watch all of the Den-O and Decade movies, the Cho Den-O series, and then I would finally get to start watching Kamen Rider Go. So that brings us to today. I finished everything related to Kamen Rider Den-O, and more importantly, I have finished everything in the original run of Kamen Rider Decade, which includes the shows, Cho Den-O and Decade Onigashima Warship, All Riders vs. Dai Shocker, and Double End Decade Movie Wars 2010, and also Cho Den-O episode Yellow. Before I get started with my main discussion, you'll notice the format to this video is going to be a little bit different. What this is I originally wrote this as an article for my Patreon, which you guys can obviously go and support this channel on. And what I decided is that I liked what I wrote, and I thought you guys might be interested in hearing it as well. So this isn't going to be as heavily edited as, say, my larger retrospective videos, but I still wanted to go and create this video for you guys, just because I wanted to share my thoughts with you guys. So if you like this, let me know. I will try to do more of these. Also, I am not an actor, so I might break my eye line quite a few times. Please bear with me. I am so sorry. With that, let's get into the discussion. Let's start our journey through Decade. So my overall impressions of the series are very conflicting. I want to preface by saying that a lot of the show can be really fun. I think it's a fun series, especially if you are fairly new to Kamen Rider and want a sampler of all the Heisei era has to offer. The show is emblematic of, it's about the journey, not the destination. And it lives that motto for all the good and all the bad it brings. For anyone who hasn't seen the show, this is the 10th anniversary season of Kamen Rider, and the main premise is that a man with amnesia named Tsukasa Kadoya is tasked by Kamen Rider Kiva, Kurenai Wataru, to protect the multiverse of Kamen Rider, and to prevent the 9 Rider worlds from combining into one. The only way he is told he can do this is by defeating all of the Riders in these alternate versions of the worlds. But instead of doing that, Tsukasa decides that he has a goal in each world, and he needs to put things right before he can move on. So he befriends each of the alternate versions of the main 9 Heisei Riders, gains their trust, gains their powers, and moves on to the next world, hoping the journey is the one home. Individual 2-part stories are fun and entertaining. Seeing the alternate interpretations of the Rider worlds is really fun. It's cool seeing the old suits again, old monsters recontextualized, loosely playing off the story beats or concepts of the original series, even if heavily remixed. But what happens if you see that same idea repeated 15 times in a row? It gets old. Now, it's not as though there are not shows that have done this style before. Quantum Leap was a very similar show in that structure. In fact, I don't doubt that there was some form of influence on Decade. A man who travels into different worlds, inhabiting the identity and role of a different person, solving unique problems, and fixing what is wrong in the world, hoping that each time he leaps between worlds, he makes it back to his own. But first of all, Quantum Leap came out in 1989, 20 years before Kamen Rider Decade. TV has changed a lot, and audiences' expectations of having a fleshed out, overarching storyline has gone up dramatically since that time, especially given that Kamen Rider Decade is not a one-off show, with no expectations of narrative style or format. Quantum Leap could be as episodic or serialized as it wanted because it was essentially its own show. But Kamen Rider Decade is the 19th entity of a well-established franchise, and it is also the 10th anniversary project of the Heisei era, and starts with tempting us with the idea at the end of the series that Decade is going to fight in an all-out battle with the other Riders to either save or destroy this world. And therefore, the entire premise of the show is about stopping this conflict. To have a show in this style choose to do a sightseeing tour of the franchise's extended history is a noble one, but it's not one without its own problems. When the show started, I was excited to see what new worlds and concepts would be put in. In Kuga's world, Tsukasa is a cop, and he works at the same police department as Yusuke and Ichijo. Ichijo is like a sister to Yusuke in this world, but their dynamic is different to the originals. That's interesting. Seeing Tsukasa easily solve the Gege game of the Grongi shows his competence, and tips the hand to the audience that he knows more than he should, despite the amnesia that he has. He and Yusuke become good buddies, and he helps him overcome his struggle and gets him through a trauma. It's a feel-good story. We go to Kiva World, and Kiva is a child. The Fangire and the humans coexist, but some of them want Wataru to start an uprising so they can feed on the humans to live. Wataru wants to be a kind king, but a Fangire stages an uprising and steals Kivat, so Wataru is no longer at Kiva. Wataru has to learn to trust people, and that allows him to ally with Decade and Kuga to regain his throne and defeat the Fangire. So, things are meaningful, stories are moving, and then we get to Ryuki World and it's like, the Riders are lawyers, and everyone thinks that Knight is a murderer, so him and Shinji don't talk, and honestly, this whole story is kind of weak. It's a fun concept, but it feels like it pumps the brakes on the overarching narratives just so they can do some funny antics. I actually like the next world, Blade World, more than I should. Given Kamen Rider Blade is not a personal favorite of mine, it was fun to see them explore Board and its dynamics with the Riders more. I do think the fact that the villain of Ryuki World is also the villain of Blade World helps makes this feel like one larger overarching story, and you could even argue that it's subtly foreshadowing the later parts of the series with Dai Shocker, but here it kind of just continues to make this feel like one large speed bump in the overall narrative. I'm gonna be frank, Fai's World and Agito World is when I really started to lose interest in this show. We started introducing DiEnd in, and while he's a nice foil to Tsukasa and the respective riders, he's kind of just an annoying nuisance a lot of the time, in my opinion. Otherwise, it's fine. Fai's world is an ironic angle because of the whole misunderstandings thing being reinterpreted as high school drama. I genuinely wish I had more to say because of how much I love Fai's, but frankly it just doesn't do much beyond hitting the main beats of Takami's secret identity and introducing DiEnd. It's pretty straightforward. Agito World is interesting in how they take the elements of Kuga that were implied in the lore and the manga, connecting it to Agito, and seemingly making that connection official, at least as far as Decade's concerned. They also bring back Yashiro, which is Ichijo's name from Kuga World, and give her a new role in Agito's world, to further drive that theme home. It's not a bad story on paper, it just didn't leave an impact on me personally. Maybe if they spent less time focusing on Yusuke and DiEnd fighting over who gets to be G3X, I'd be a little bit more invested. Then we get to Den-O World. Den-O World is the point where Decade falls apart, and consistency of the universe falls apart, and the seams lay bare. I want you guys to keep in mind, Den-O was my first full Rider season. I actually still love Kamen Rider Den-O even after my rewatch. Although, to be fair, I had just binged the last arc of Den-O and 2 Den-O movies the week prior to writing this, so maybe it's my own fault I didn't enjoy this arc as much, but I feel that this world reflects what I feel is a big problem behind the scenes with Toei and the Kamen Rider franchise at this time. So, these episodes do not feel like Decade in Den-O's world, they feel like Den-O side stories featuring Decade. Momotaros gets significantly more focus than a lot of the AR Riders do, the other Imaging all get their time to shine. This is because as soon as the Imagine possesses either Tsukasa, Yusuke, or Natsumi, they can transform and fight as Den-O, with the respective actor dubbing them over. Yusuke spends most of this two-parter as a meat puppet for Momotaros, where he's transformed into Den-O. You can't even tell it's Yusuke anymore. It's just Den-O. On top of that, the episode uses Den-O's soundtrack and sound cues quite a lot in both the fights and even the dramatic scenes, making it feel even less like a part of the proper Decade series. The episode's primary conflict is about Momotaros not having his body, and so he possesses Yusuke and Tsukasa so he can fight the Imagine in his world. DiEnd offers to turn him into a train by way of final form ride cards of the Denliner. Momotaros wants to have his body back and wants to find Ryotaro so he can reimagine it for him. The other Imagine possess Natsumi so that they can defeat Decade, and along the way we see Momotaros protect the body he's hosting in. Tsukasa tells Momotaros that he can just imagine his own body himself, and all that jazz. It's corny, but when it comes to the themes of imagination, it's often a little on the nose, to be fair. Tsukasa gets the final form ride card, and instead of Denliner, it's Momotaros. Momotaros becomes himself again, and they defeat the Imagines. But, alongside all that, you have the villains of the Chodeno Onigashima Warship movie shoehorned in, setting up things that won't be resolved until you go to see the movie in the theaters, including the ending of this two-parter ending in a cliffhanger. What I'm saying is that this two-parter feels like it exists to advertise a Den-O movie and less to be an adventure for Tsukasa and his friends to go on. Now, I personally believe that this decision has bigger ripples than just these 2 episodes, so I will put a pin in that for now. Now, I don't have much to actually say about Onigashima Warship in relation to Decade because, well, it's not a Decade movie, it's a Den-O movie with an extended cameo from some of the Decade cast. As a movie, it's a better kids' fantasy movie if you forget it's about Kamen Rider half the time. They had the main character, Yu, who is a decent enough lead. The problem is just that this is not a movie advertised as about being about Yu. It's about Chodeno, Decade, and the Onigashima Warship. Speaking of not getting enough Decade, so moving on to Hibiki and Kabuto World, I actually feel like the show starts to find its footing again, and I quite like these worlds. Once again, they don't really contribute to the overall larger narrative of Decade, but in isolation they are enjoyable reflections on the themes of their respective shows. Kabuto World is much more somber than the rest, and doesn't really necessarily end on a happy note, but rather one much more hopeful and optimistic. It ends the way a story in Decade should end, emotionally conflicted, but satisfying. Hibiki World is just straight up an apology for the ending of the original series, having most of the original cast come back, and properly placing Asumu as the successor to Hibiki's legacy. They actually show Hibiki a lot of love throughout the series of Decade, and that goes a long way in legitimizing a series in an era where it may have been common for people to not call it a real Kamen Rider series. They also give Kiva a fair amount of love as well, especially in the next world, as once the final world is completed, the team are greeted by Kurenai Otoya, the father of Kurenai Wataru, the man who introduced Tsukasa to the calamity of the Rider Worlds fusing together at the start of the series, who are both played by their respective Kiva actors. We even get to see the Fangire trio back in the Kiva episode, as well as in the Onigashima Warship movie, so a good majority of the Kiva cast get to come back for Decade, which probably makes up for the fact that they didn't get a movie or any of the other love that Den-O was getting at the time. Nega World, and I'm going to put that right here on the screen just so you know what I said, is one of the weirdest worlds so far, as it's primarily a Natsumi-focused story, focusing on her friend group from school, her nostalgia of youth and her optimism, and how Decade's influence over the world sees to corrupt that. It attempts to sow seeds of doubt of Natsumi of Decade, however, this world's Natsumi reassures her that Tsukasa is the right person to save them using the power of a Decade-inspired BlackBerry cell phone from 2009. The K-Touch is both really cool and also incredibly underwhelming, but I love the symmetrical choreography between Decade and the other rider, and I am not ashamed to admit I love the Decade complete suit. That color scheme and the simple additions really do speak to me. But don't get it twisted, Decade Complete 21 is total garbage. Anyway, it kinda just comes out of nowhere and really only does one thing. It was a new era of Kamen Rider gimmicks, so generally you would still use the original belt piece as well as the new upgrade, as Decade still needs a Deca driver in order to do the finishing moves, which he keeps on his hip, which is also very visually pleasing to me. With only 10 episodes left, it really makes you wonder what worlds they're going to prioritize for the remainder of the season. And our selections for the final 5 worlds featured in Kamen Rider Decade are Blade Missing Ace, Samurai Sentai Shinkenger, Kamen Rider Black RX, Kamen Rider Black, and Kamen Rider Amazon. I have absolutely no idea what they were thinking when they were deciding these worlds. It is incredibly bizarre to make a separate world around a movie from a show that's already in Decade, and to make that DiEnd's homeworld. But I surprisingly enjoy this world, as well as most of the later half worlds. This chunk of the show really wants to play with the concepts around the larger universe and the big imposing threat of Dai Shocker, and the ramification of Tsukasa and Kaito's actions. While it's no secret that I think Kaito is a one-note character, I do think devoting a story to his world and the conflicts makes a lot of sense, even if his past self seems really incongruous with his current depiction. We also start to get some better integration of Narutaki, the mysterious man who has been warning Natsumi this entire time to avoid Decade, and stating how his influence is going to destroy these worlds. We see this concept executed in full force in a very special story, Shinkenger World. I don't have any of my Shinkenger stuff with me, so I'm just gonna... I can't see it, there's too much glare. Beyond just the novelty of this being the first full episode crossover of Kamen Rider and Super Sentai, Shinkenger World is honestly one of the best stories in the show, and I do think it is separate from my nostalgia and personal attachment to the episode. It mostly plays off of how the Shinkengers react to Tsukasa's threat on their world, and how him and Kaito being there is creating problems in their world with the creation of the Gedoshu DiEnd. Even if half the time you just have Ryunosuke and Genta mugging up for the camera, Shinken Red, Takaru, is protective of their mentor G. No, not that mentor G, the other mentor G. I mean, they're kind of the same mentor G. There is an efficient parallel about the Shinkengers having a familial unit, with G being like Natsumi's grandpa, in a sense. It builds towards the idea of Hikari Studio being like a home for Decade, Yusuke, and Natsumi. And honestly, I'm just surprised how much actual story they've crammed into this special crossover episode. I'm used to most shows letting the crossover do the heavy lifting, but honestly this episode felt completely in line with the tone of Decade up until this point, and honestly a little bit better than what we've gotten up until now. Black RX, Black, and Amazon's world all kind of fall under the same idea, being that these are worlds already infested with Dai Shocker's influence, and therefore becoming flooded with monsters who don't belong here. The worlds are beginning to fuse, and that's what's causing the two Black worlds to intermingle. The fight with the two Minami Kotaros gets a little fan-wanky, a little too fan-servicey, but I don't think it's too egregious. It's overall a solid enough set of episodes. You know, I just realized while I was reading the script and recording that the two non-Heisei Rider worlds that are actual Kamen Rider series that Decade features are the two shows that got Amazon Prime exclusive gritty adult reboots, and I'm curious if they already assumed that these series were popular enough, or if that's just a really big coincidence. It's probably a really big coincidence. I figured I might as well mention it. The Amazon two-parter is incredibly weird, though. It's the last major storyline before the show begins, and yet it still has time to be a story about Amazon helping the child Masahiko be free of the influence of Dai Shocker. It's less an Amazon tribute in more ways than it's a conflict in Amazon's world. I think I enjoy that approach better, and it's why I like these later Decade episodes a lot more than the earlier ones, as it feels like there's far more at stake and far more proactivity on both sides of the conflict. It gave me vibes of what Gokaiger would do, where they would have to help a veteran ranger or get them to entrust their powers to them, whereas in Decade, Tsukasa is usually the one imparting his wisdom and advice onto the AR Rider, and so Tsukasa isn't really learning any lessons, and he's usually seen as kind of the older brother figure of the AR Riders, at least for most of them. Also giving me vibes of Gokaiger is the movie that takes place here, All Riders vs. Dai Shocker. Yes, 2 episodes before the end of the series, they released their movie, All Riders vs. Dai Shocker. This movie is an absolute mess if you are trying to fit it into the continuity with the rest of the series. It is straight up incompatible with the story being told at this point. But it is an absolute blast if you are a lapsed Rider fan, taking your kids to the theater to go see all the Kamen Riders beat up the bad guys. The movie tries to be really evergreen, so they basically have to set up a slightly different premise for the Rider conflict, so that they all must compete in a tournament to stop the destruction of the worlds. This, however, is just a ploy to begin Dai Shocker's attack on the world. Tsukasa tortured and committed war crimes against Ridermen. Tsukasa was a terrible person in his previous life, and the movie never attempts to redeem him. They just make you feel sad because he has no friends and he was kicked out of Dai Shocker. He was perfectly content conquering the worlds when he was the one in charge. Anyway, his sister takes control of Kuga's body, Kuga gets left out of the big Rider team-up, Shin kills some people, and the Power Scalers are left fuming when Rising Ultimate Kuga can't beat Shadow Moon, but Kamen Rider Double can effortlessly defeat Shadow Moon. Honestly, the pre-series Rider cameo may be the biggest lasting impact that this movie has had on the franchise. Is what I would say if this wasn't the highest grossing Kamen Rider movie of all time up until Shin Kamen Rider released 14 years later in 2023. And this movie changed the trajectory of Kamen Rider movies to be this big annual team-up every year featuring all the Kamen Riders and eventually leading to the Tyson lineup of films crossing over with Super Sentai and Metal Hero. As for the final 2 episodes, there are actually 2 versions, but they are mostly the same minus the start of episode 30 and the ending of episode 31. Basically, the worlds are coming to an end, and so riders are having to team up with villains to protect their world. Blade and Kiva refuse to work together until Tsukasa convinces them they can all work together and save their worlds. Also, the Undead and the Fangire were secretly working for Dai Shocker, so this joint venture would have had to have happened regardless. Hibiki joins in, but he is led astray by the real Kazuma, the OG Kamen Rider Blade. How he got here is never explained, and frankly I don't think this works very effectively. I've since accepted that the real versions of Kenzaki and Wataru in the show are still not the same characters from their respective shows, but I just don't find the execution of this concept very compelling. Tsukasa has no clue who this guy is, and he has a much deeper connection to Kendate Kazuma, AR Hibiki, and Kiva shouldn't be listening to him either, because they already have a blade. When it was just Kiva at the start of the show guiding Tsukasa, fixing the parallel worlds, I could forgive and forget the reasons why this doesn't really mesh well. First of all, it's the first episode, so early installment weirdness and all that. But then you have the real Blade and the fake Blade both trying to stop Tsukasa, and this conflict gets very muddled and confused. Having the entire Dai Shocker storyline basically be squeezed into 6 episodes doesn't really help things either. Black RX, Black, and Amazon set up the new conflict, and status quo in that Decade is going to have to team up with them against Dai Shocker and liberate their worlds. But before we have time to wrap that up, the final 2-parter is here, where they also have to contend with the Rider War storyline. So, episode 30 and 31 have Decade regaining the trust of AR, Blade, Kiva, and Hibiki just in time for real Blade to show up and tell them that they've all been fighting the wrong person, and that he wants them to kill Decade as well. But ultimately, the real issue here is the ending. The ending of the episode, the one so infamous that there are still rumors that persist that people tried to sue Toei over it. So, the final episode kicks in. Decade, DiEnd, Kuga, Hibiki, and Kiva all save Natsumi from Apollo Geist. He's the big bad of Shocker. He's originally from Kamen Rider X and from X's world. But he's the main villain of Dai Shocker in this season. And he's only been in the last, 6 or so episodes. Once the riders all defeat Apollo Geist, Natsumi realizes where they are, and recognizes her torn up clothes and realizes this is the same place she dreamt about all the way back in the first episode of Decade. Yusuke had taken a fatal blow in the final battle with Apollo Geist and is revived by Kivala, another character who I haven't mentioned up until now, who is a Kivat bat from Kiva World, who only really existed to hang out with Grandpa and to flirt with Yusuke, which, to be fair, he needs a fangirl in this season. She revives him, and he turns into Ultimate Kuga with the evil eyes, and so he joins with all of the other riders to destroy Decade. They all fight when suddenly DiEnd runs in, goes point blank to Tsukasa with his gun, and Natsumi yells, "Decade!" Then cut to a trailer for the Decade ending, featuring all these crazy scenes of Tsukasa clones, evil Yusuke, Narutaki, a female Kiva rider, and Tsukasa drowning, telling audiences they will get the answers if they spend money and go see the Kamen Rider Double and Decade crossover movie coming up in a couple months. And that's how it ends. Unless you saw the re-edited version made for subsequent broadcasts. Once they filmed the Double and Decade movie, they got Natsumi's actress to film a quick scene of her dreaming about the Rider War for the start of episode 30 to help connect things a bit better to that upcoming film. They also changed the ending so that instead of literally stopping mid-scene, they now have it so that it all comes full circle, and they reuse as much footage as they can from the first episode of all the riders fighting against Decade, with new narration from Natsumi trying to spin the fight as hopeful and optimistic, while also blatantly telling the audience the story of Decade doesn't end here, further reinstating how they have to shell out money to see a movie in order to see the ending of the series. Beyond the insane number of continuity issues that this scene creates, I don't think this ending works either. I think it's cheap, I think it's lazy, it once again doesn't fix the issue of it not being an ending, even if it's more of a bookend situation. It's arguably more satisfying because at least it attempts to close out the story, even if it's just putting a bookmark down between chapters. And so that's the original series ending of Kamen Rider Decade. There's still one story left to be told. The Kamen Rider Net movies, where they have to help Stronger find Tackle and get Shin his own series. No. But wouldn't that be fun? Before I discuss the ending of the series, which is plopped into a movie sharing half its runtime with another movie, I need to talk about Decade as its own product first. So Kamen Rider Decade is a mess, plain and simple. My best assessment of Decade is it starts off strong, hooks you with that concept, and then quickly starts to peter off into spinning its wheels for most of the season. The middle chunk of Heisei Rider Worlds is very cookie cutter, and after the 6th or 7th time seeing the same story idea going on and on and on, it kind of loses its impact. As for fan service, I will admit I consume Decade Henshin compilation videos on YouTube on a regular basis, so a lot of the excitement and freshness of seeing the rider transformations has become desensitized to me personally, but I still do think it can be a lot of fun and you can enjoy it, especially if you haven't already seen the series. It's very fun to see all the cool suits come back. It does get kind of routine seeing him mostly just use the powers he got from the last episode, such as, in Ryuki's world, he was in Kiva's world before, so he has Kiva's card and will use that to fight Ryuki. For being the first of their anniversary style shows, there was no real structure or formula to adhere to, and considering most of these rider suits you had only been able to see in HD if you had gone to see one of their theatrical movies, seeing the old powers and attacks is cool in its own right just for that. As for how Decade uses his powers, I wouldn't say it's very narratively satisfying, but it does still make the fights fun. Now what I mean by that is, unlike in Gokaiger, which seemingly went out of its way to make each Gokai change have some kind of reference or thematic importance, or something that only like super duper nerds would notice, like me, I do wish that Decade did a better job of making the suits have some thematic importance to what's going on in the episode rather than just being what was earned last time. But I suppose function over doing references has its own benefits. And Decade definitely has a preference for the more useful riders. Ryuki, Blade, Hibiki, Kabuto, and Kiva all get a fair bit of use, whereas Agito, Faiz, and Den-O don't really get as much time in the spotlight. Kuga actually, I think, gets more time to fight than those, and he's supposed to be used less, considering Yusuke is already on the team as Kuga, and Decade only really gets to use Kuga when Yusuke is not around. So that's kind of weird on its own. Once we get to Decade Complete, Tsukasa stops using the transformation cards nearly as often, and mostly just sticks with summoning the riders in complete mode. And there's a very cynical angle I can take about how once Decade gets their powers and has stolen the identity of the original rider character, he then operates their suit like a lifeless puppet being used as nothing more than a product of advertising. Okay, I'm just gonna leave it there. DiEnd's powers don't really make sense. The more I think about where his powers come from within Dai Shocker, the bigger headache I get. Half the time DiEnd shows up just to get in Tsukasa's way and spawn villain riders, and sometimes actual main riders too. I have no idea why he has cards for like Blade and Den-O. I mean, it's an effective strategy. Toei gets to finally get some return on investment on all those Rider Trooper suits and movie rider suits they made back in the day, as well as getting to showcase some of the riders who haven't appeared in the main series up until this point. I do really like the Final Form rides. I think it's fun. It's the goofiest thing in the show, and it helps keep the whole tone of the early episodes consistent with each other. Of course, you can't discuss Final Form rides without mentioning Hibiki's, and that's such an iconic scene in Decade that it's worth watching just for that alone. To discuss the characters, I want to start with Natsumi because she's the easiest to explain. She has a prophecy, and then is hesitant around the whole journey until the end where she says, "I remember this." Yeah, if you've been following my other major retrospective, Megaforce, The History of the Power Rangers, you would know that there's a character who also has that same storyline, and now I'm wondering if Saban watched Decade where they trademarked Power Rider and decided to copy some notes for their anniversary season. I do really like the episode of Evil Rider World, where we get to see Natsumi's past life with her friends in school, and the bleak tragedy that Decade could cause this to happen to her world too if she's not choosing her allies carefully. She also hits people with random pressure points, and we all laugh because it's never explained, never rationalized in the story, always is a deus ex machina, and worst of all, just isn't very funny. If anybody should have a quirky special move where they make people laugh with their thumb, it should be Kamen Rider Kuga. Thumbs up are literally his whole thing. Speaking of which, let's move on to Kuga himself, Yusuke Onodera, and the other AR riders. So Onodera is not the same guy as Godai. They are very different Yusuke's. I welcome the change at first, as I felt it was important to illustrate how the core themes of the character exist, even if the person is different. Like, Kuga is still Kuga, even if it's not the same guy. Generally, I think that works, and when I was a teenager who hadn't watched Kuga, I had no context, so I just rolled with it. But Yusuke Onodera is a butt monkey. He follows everyone around, he's overly optimistic, kind of an idiot, and is quite often the butt of many jokes, which is, again, not at all in line with Yusuke Godai. I really wish this wasn't the case, as it does start to feel a little bit like they're pissing on Kuga's legacy. Having the guy who started your entire era of television get a sword shoved up his ass and then used as a projectile weapon by your new golden child, Momotaros, feels a little disrespectful. There are moments where you can see what made the original Kuga such an impactful character shine through, but it's not often enough to make up for the weak elements of the character. It feels like they took a side character like the Milk Guy from Blade, or Ozaki and Miura from Den-O, and turned them into a Kamen Rider. I'm just gonna knock out the AR riders who don't play into the overall story first, before getting into the somewhat more important ones. AR Ryuki is fine, he's just kind of forgettable. He feels kind of bland. Honestly, I'm gonna get some heat for this one. He feels closer to Kit from Kamen Rider Dragon Knight than Kido from Ryuki. AR Fies is a nice enough kid, again, just kind of there. The episode was honestly more focused in setting up DiEnd, so it's understandable they didn't do too much with him. I did like the story, it just was kind of forgettable. I don't think it's inherently a bad interpretation of Takumi. You know, pretty safe, pretty straightforward interpretation of that character. AR Agito was kind of a cool idea. AR Agito World was somewhat a mirror of Kuga World, so having him have a similar relationship to Yashiro, which Yashiro was the actual name of the Ichijo-like character in Kuga's world, and therefore she has a counterpart in Agito's world as well. AR Agito turns into gills, and he was the original user of G3. I kind of like the idea of having all three of these forms represented by one person. It sort of unifies the whole world, and it does kind of makes it feel like Decade had a larger influence as he manages to reform Gills and get him to turn back into Agito. AR Kabuto is different because he's barely in the episode, but instead you learn about him through the narrative. Him and Agito are really the only old guy riders, and by old I mean just not in high school or college or a literal child like two of them are. But I found his nuance to the story more enjoyable, especially since Tsukasa and Kabuto don't fix his problem, but Kabuto makes a sacrifice so that his sister can live peacefully at the expense of not getting to be with her and her grandmother anymore, because he gets stuck in a clock-up state permanently. Momotaros is the last of the Heisei riders who isn't a main part of the story, and frankly, I'm both happy and shocked that they did not make him a recurring character in the show. Maybe they thought all the movies and being a TV regular would be too much, or maybe the Decade writers thought Momotaros was too funny to work in a serious role, which is incredibly ironic, because in the actual show, the Taros have enough nuance to be serious characters, but you never know that just watching Decade. You would know that if you spent the last several months watching all of Den-O and all the Den-O movies and all the Den-O supplementary material like I have. But either way, he's here. He's arrived. He's Momotaros. I have no idea if the Den-O World story is supposed to be in canon of the actual Den-O series, or if Den-O World just looks remarkably similar to actual Den-O World. Given the fact that Chodeno Onigashima Warship uses the same Ryotaro actor, and given the fact that later DiEnd shows up in Chodeno in the Chodeno episode Yellow movie, I've personally had canon that all Chodeno material takes place with the cast being from the AR Decade version of Den-O. I have read some theories, some speculation, maybe I should do a whole video about it. You know, maybe Ryotaro is a singularity point, so there can only be one of him. So there can't be an AR world, whatever. DiEnd wants to turn Momotaros into a train. Somehow Momotaros lost his body thanks to the movie villains, Ryotaro is missing, and the other Taros are busy possessing everyone in town and trying to kill Decade. I do like that they have Decade fail initially, and so the world of Den-O is temporarily destroyed. It is strange to have such a comedic show have such dire story beats. Momotaros' story is easily the most basic and frankly undercooked of all the AR riders, not helped by all of the runtime being dedicated to promoting a movie. As I said before, it doesn't really feel like a Decade episode, so it's hard to really qualify any feeling about it when it feels like I'm watching a completely different show. I should probably also cover the Kotaro Minamis, as well as Amazon. I do like that they made Black RX Kotaro more friendly and optimistic, while Kamen Rider Black's Kotaro is a little more jaded and cynical, as well as fits the tone of the original series a little bit more. The idea that Joe the Haze, Kotaro's friend, went back into Black's world to help fight with him is interesting. It's nice that RX Kotaro is not saddened by his friend leaving. It's all very feel-goody, but am I the only person that interpreted it wrong and thought that Joe the Haze actually died? And Tsukasa was just kind of lying, saying, "Oh, your friend, he's good, he's fighting with the other Kotaro in another world, and you can't see him, but he's there." I know Black Kotaro mentioned seeing him, but we never see this character on screen, so unless Decade literally became this man, like a literal quantum leap situation, I just assumed that Joe the Haze died. As for Amazon, I want to give some leeway here, but I gotta be frank, they didn't really give this actor very good direction. I never really believed that he's a jungle boy, I never really connected with his earnestness about friendship. The kid character Masahiko is really the focal point of the story, and I think that's done well enough. Also, the Amazon actor is terrible at doing the Amazon sounds. No offense to the actor, but it was a stylistic choice that his proclamation of Amazon and Daisetsudan sounds really bored. He's more like Amazon and Daisetsudan. Moving on to Kiva, Blade, and Hibiki, it's interesting that they chose these three riders as the ones who would be most important to the story besides Yusuke. Kiva is a very solid story to start the season with after Kuga. Being Kiva's whole story is already about bloodlines, family, the dynamic between him and his father, making him a child is a very unique angle. It also very blatantly telegraphs to the children at home, these are not the riders that you know. Kids might not have seen 2000's Kamen Rider Kuga in the year 2009, but it is very likely that they have seen 2008's Kamen Rider Kiva, the show literally right before Kamen Rider Decade, and to make it even more obvious, in the first episode, the actual Kiva, Kurenai Wataru, makes an appearance, as well as in subsequent episodes, making the distinction very clear and direct. This Wataru is a bit bratty, a little prideful, but he's still a kid who has to be in charge of the fate of all of his people. It's perhaps deliberately a role he's saddled with the entire series, as he's put into this very same role again for the ending arc, where he has to decide to have the Fangire team up with the Riders in order to eliminate Kamen Rider Blade from their world when the worlds start to fuse at the end of the series. I do like that he never learns the identity of the rogue Fangire was his father. It's both on brand for Kiva's misunderstandings, and also doesn't sully the ending with a dramatic moment of him being upset and crying, when the previous Kuga episodes ended the same way. Jumping ahead to Hibiki for a second, I do like what they did with Asumu. First of all, the fact that it's Asumu at all is just great. Hibiki notoriously dropped the ball hard on the ending of the series. Unlike the original series, where Asumu chooses to go off on his own path, and instead the baton is passed to Kyosuke, in this world, Asumu is thrust into the role of having to take up Hibiki's mantle after Hibiki becomes unable to control his Oni powers anymore, and trusts that Asumu can handle it. Throughout the story, Asumu has to pick a side between Ibuki and Zanki's Oni faction, and eventually winds up allying himself with Kaito, who becomes sort of a mentor to him. This uneasiness in his decision to pick up the mantle and pick a side was a good reason to bring him back in the finale arc, as he very much has to make the same decision again when it comes to helping Decade or defeating him. For Blade, when it comes to Kazuma, I really like him. I've made it no secret that I'm not a big fan of Blade, and I found the original Kenzaki Kazuma to be a bit of a fairly blank slate character. Please do not reply with that scene from Blade where he squirts the lemons into Hajime's eyes. Please don't reply with that scene of him being a dumbass forgetting which rouser he has in his hands while he's sleeping in the couch. Please don't send the scene of him getting arrested for shoplifting. Those are funny. I don't feel like they're representative so much of his character as just funny scenes they wrote for anybody. But anyway, so to see Kendate Kazuma be a little sassy, have a little bit of attitude, to be a down on his luck guy working his way up in a corporate system, I found it very refreshing. In general, Kendate Kazuma is a guy I really enjoyed seeing, and I think his story was a lot of fun. Considering the final few episodes focus so much on the real Blade, it honestly makes me wonder just a little bit if we should have had Kendate Kazuma be Tsukasa's sidekick and not Yusuke Onodera. It feels like at the start, they really wanted to make Yusuke be the secondary main rider, but quickly started making him be the butt of the jokes all the time, and began setting up DiEnd to take that place. On top of the fact that Kenzaki Kazuma, the real Blade, shows up in the final 2 episodes, you'd really think that they'd want to play on the original rider versus the AR rider concept, the one that Tsukasa has a greater personal connection to. Obviously, you weren't going to get Joe Odagiri to return as Godai Yusuke, but it makes me wonder if they had they give him the same role that Kenzaki Kazuma's actor plays, and have him be this cool, edgy Matrix kind of guy who is here to kill Decade from the real worlds. Real Kazuma and real Wataru are cool in the don't think about it kind of way. Since I'm on the topic of Blade, I'll talk about DiEnd and his world, since his world is based on the Blade Missing Ace movie. I love that DiEnd's brother, Junichi, Kamen Rider Glaive, was the twist villain. It's such a cool little bit, especially a really good callback to the original movie, but considering this is the only real story we get for DiEnd in the main series, it just kind of introduces this, and then it never really is going to come up again because the show doesn't have a time or place for it. I have now seen Chodeno episode Yellow as of the point of recording the script, so I can say that that is some of the most hackneyed crap you can write for a character like Kaido, and honestly, it is so stupid and contrived, it retroactively makes me like DiEnd less, somehow, and I'm not going to talk about that movie here. I will talk about it at some point. The whole DiEnd was just a cop working for the Roaches and ratted out his brother who then got lobotomized. It's just such an extreme storyline that doesn't really fit the larger narrative of Decade. Considering he is confirmed to have gotten his Deca driver from Dai Shocker in a throwaway line in the All Riders vs. Dai Shocker movie, we don't really know anything about that guy. It's not helped by the fact that DiEnd is just a catchphrase spewing one-note character. He physically cannot help himself from using the word treasure in almost every conversation he is in. It really mitigates a lot of his intrigue and makes me not take the character seriously. He doesn't talk like a real person. Beyond that, and the sea cucumber joke, I genuinely cannot think of any other interpretation for Kaito's relationship than Tsukasa other than shipping joke. There's this scene in the final episode of Decade where he has this big emotional moment where he cries to Tsukasa about he has to be the one to beat him. I try not to read too much into fan memes and shipping culture when I'm trying to sincerely analyze the material that I'm looking at, but if I don't look at this scene through the lens of shipping, then Kaito is just this insane man, crying about how he has to kill Tsukasa, like he's the Vegeta to his Goku, except without any of the backstory that makes that dynamic work in any meaningful way. But with that, we come to the main man himself, Tsukasa. I think Tsukasa Kataya is kind of boring in his own series, to be perfectly honest. I think he's flat, he's stoic, he's insincere with his emotions, even when he's being sincere. I don't think he's acted badly, I don't think it's a bad direction, and honestly, I don't really say that actors are bad really so much because it's very obvious that it's never always just the actor, it's oftentimes bad directing. And I just don't know what they were trying to do with his character. He's entertaining, it's fun seeing him be another dickhead rider. We haven't had one of those since Tendo, Kamen Rider Kabuto. We won't get that style again for quite a while. He's funny, he's sassy, and he's generally pretty entertaining to watch on screen. His in-suit demeanor is a little lacking. It's not inherently bad. Unfortunately, some of that does come down to just every single thing he does needing a card to be scanned first, so it does make some of his movement seem awkward, slow, and rigid. Still, he gets enough cool guy moments and cool guy actions to overall make him a pretty cool guy to watch fight. Now, if you'll allow me a second of some tinfoil hat theory here, I feel that Tsukasa is actually depressed, and that this journey is maybe him reclaiming his identity and his life in a universe that wants nothing more to eliminate him from it. After being wide-eyed and optimistic at the start, we gradually see him get more jaded and bitter, until he inevitably becomes the thing that people warned he would become, a cold, calculated destroyer. And while it was fun for me to kind of put that little idea together, and I've seen some other people say that too, it's not really all that accurate. Tsukasa is very inconsistent throughout the show and how they write his character. He's pretty jaded and quippy throughout the start of the show, and he's pretty optimistic and hopeful even by the end of the show. A lot of my interpretation really comes from the Double and Decade movie, which I will get into in a moment. But to put a nail in this idea, I don't think that Tsukasa being a case of having his emotional state gradually deteriorate is intentional to the story of the show. I don't see it. Even if it was there, it would most certainly be subtext, not the actual text. And, authorial intent is only going to take you so far. I don't see enough of this here in the actual show for me to comfortably say that. It's like a fun little thought experiment, and it's like if I want to try to rationalize some things, I can do it. Tsukasa is never really motivated by his emotions. He's not really motivated by much of anything, besides really his desire to protect Natsumi and find his way home. Only really in the final episodes of the show does it become a recurring idea that Natsumi and Hikari Studio are the home that Tsukasa has been looking for this whole time, and in a show that was given a chance to end, I would have believed it would have resulted in such a resolution. Although, on the subject of that, it's probably best we talk about the actual ending of Kamen Rider Decade, Kamen Rider Double and Decade, Movie War 2010. This is the second traditional Kamen Rider team-up movie of the Heisei era, although technically it's the third if you count Chodeno and Decade. This would be a recurring trend every year that still goes on even today. This movie is broken up into 3 segments: Double Begins Night, Decade Final Chapter, and Movie Wars 2010. Begins Night is a Kamen Rider Double story, and while I completely glossed over Onigashima Warship due to it not actually being a Kamen Rider Decade story in any capacity, I will be glossing over some of the main bullet points of Begins Night. However, I will say, just to get it off the bat, it's really good. It's worth watching when you are rewatching Decade, as it's both a prequel to Double, so it works as a good standalone story that you can watch without being familiar with the material, for the most part, and there is some material that is relevant to Decade's second half of the movie, so I will be focusing this in regards to what material ties in with Decade. Also, there's nowhere for me to actually put this into the review proper of the movie, but I did want to mention that apparently in the theatrical release, the movie starts with Decade Final Chapter, then goes to Double Begins Night, but on the director cut, which is what I watched, it starts with Double Begins Night and then goes to Decade Final Chapter. So I am writing this from the perspective of somebody who watched the director's cut. So I'm going to be talking, like I said, I'm going to be talking about Double first. But if you saw this in theaters or have only seen the vanilla theatrical cut, Decade's actually supposed to go before Double, which makes sense from like a hype system. But I think the movie actually flows better if you start with Double and then work your way to the Decade stuff. So Begins Night has the Narumi Detective Agency going to solve the mystery of a woman whose deceased sister has returned to life. But throughout the film, we have a flashback to the start of the show, showcasing the events in which Philip got released from Foundation X, how Shotaro's mentor, Sokichi Narumi, died, saving his life, and shows extended scenes of the two boys first becoming the 2-in-1 Kamen Rider Double, as well as some cool scenes of Fang Joker early to get those holiday sales. This is important because while the gang are looking for the deceased sister, they actually run into Narumi, who is able to transform into his Kamen Rider form, Kamen Rider Skull, and fights Shotaro. Narumi defeating Shotaro reminds him of how he was too brash and how that got Narumi killed in the first place, so that guilt and feeling of not being good enough lingers all throughout the story. Eventually, when they figure out who the dopant is, they catch him and Shotaro stands up to the ghost of his mentor figure and defeats him, proving that he is the man Narumi always said he could be, and reveals that the death dopant is actually the dummy dopant, and that he wasn't actually bringing people back to life, but instead just imitating their appearance. The dopant flees, and with Double giving chase, that is the end of his portion of the movie. For the Decade Final Chapter portion, we see Tsukasa finally assume the role we were always told he would be, the one who will destroy all the riders. He goes on an absolute murder spree, killing every last rider, even the ones he met along the way, like Ryuki and Blaine. Yusuke becomes the last rider, and Natsumi still believes there's good left in Tsukasa, while obviously Yusuke thinks that hope is long gone. Tsukasa is hanging around with a girl named Yuriko, who is later revealed to be Tackle from Kamen Rider Stronger. I wonder if she's aware that Tsukasa killed Stronger from her universe, but anyway. Yuriko asks Tsukasa why he looks at the cards after he defeats a rider, and it's so he can remember them, as at least that's what they deserve. Kaito stops by to be a dick and tell both of them that he knows that Yuriko is supposed to be dead, as the Wasp Queen kills her by poisoning her, which is a very similar situation to what happened to the real Tackle in the series Kamen Rider Stronger. And so Yuriko is this clever little meta joke about how she doesn't want to be forgotten, how Tsukasa wants to remember her even after she meets with her inevitable fate, as Tsukasa knew about this beforehand and even know that she doesn't have a card in his deck. Not only is her death poignant on its own, but it parallels Narumi's death and extended life, in the way that one is a shadow of a dead man haunting over the living's memories, and the other is a woman soon to be dead, and the man trying to keep her memory alive in spite of everyone else forgetting her. She dies to protect Natsumi, and after this, Yusuke and Tsukasa go into battle. Yusuke goes ultimate, and he says this really cool line about how he will protect everyone's smiles, and honestly, it reminded me of something that Godai Yusuke would have done, and even takes Tsukasa and himself and flies into a power plant in a self-sacrificial move to end the conflict. Sadly, it fails, and with the last shred of decency gone from Tsukasa, Natsumi agrees to let Kivala transform her into a Kamen Rider, and Natsumi fights Tsukasa, killing him. Once Decade dies, his memories of the riders collected in the photo book from the photos he took throughout the show bring him back to life and restore their worlds. However, Tsukasa doesn't come back, and he doesn't have a picture of himself for everyone to remember him by. Everyone comes together between Kaito, Natsumi, Yusuke, and the other 7 AR riders remember their time with Tsukasa and what they taught him on their journey, and that memory brings Tsukasa back to life the way they remember him. The way they remember him. You can tell this was not the original intended ending of the series, because there's no way it would have wrapped up this cleanly without the additional time and hindsight they were given to plan out this ending. Also, my headcanon is this is like the Star Trek transporter hypothetical, and this is not the real Tsukasa at all. The other characters brought Tsukasa back with their memories, and memories are never 100% accurate, especially if you got like 10 different people contributing their thoughts and feelings. As soon as he comes back, he's got his original haircut, he's smiling, he's cracking jokes. This is a new guy who is based on the feelings they all have about the old Tsukasa, the one that they remember. The real evil Tsukasa is actually dead. Disregarding my little joke theory, I do like this ending to their story. I do like that Decade's journey did eventually amount to something, and the warm message of memories being able to keep someone's legacy alive is one very fitting of Decade. Even if our memory isn't exactly the same, the core themes of Kamen Rider of humanity, protecting the innocents, being able to take a curse and turning it into a blessing all ring true no matter if it's the original or a new version of that same classic rider. Now, the movie isn't over yet, and they still gotta go beat the crap out of the villains from Kamen Rider ZO. Also, a CGI mammoth and the Christ ship show up again. And it's here where Decade and Double finally team up, kill all the bad guys. Double gets a final form ride that is just foreshadowing the ending of Double, and then Tsukasa leaves, but he gave Shotaro a card featuring Kamen Rider Skull. This card summons Sokachi Narumi, but from an alternate world. This man doesn't recognize the Double cast, but he tells Shotaro that he wears his hat like a real man, and he trusts his face. This gives Shotaro and the cast the closure that they needed in mourning their deceased chief, and honestly a scenario that only could have worked thanks to the unique nature of Decade's world building. Tsukasa is now all ready to return to his home, Hikari Studio, the place that he belongs with his friends, ready to go on whatever journey the wall scroll takes them on next. So this movie was really damn good, and it was a great way to end Kamen Rider Decade. Maybe not the absolute best ending for the series that it could have had, given the way that the show actually ended, though. I think this is the best way they could have followed up that cliffhanger. When I talk about Kamen Rider Decade as a whole, I'm very much inclined to include this movie as part of the discussion of its narrative and its quality. I think this movie is essential in fundamentally enjoying and watching Kamen Rider Decade. Without it, the show just does not have an ending. At all. It's completely unsatisfying, and if I didn't know there was a movie to go watch right after, I would have been livid. I'm sure even knowing there was a movie, the ending of the show is still genuinely a piss-poor approach. Now, Kamen Rider Decade only had 31 episodes, but it did have 2 movies, one of which was a huge crossover featuring every single main Kamen Rider at the time, and the other was a big-budget Kamen Rider Den-O movie. This was, in fact, the 4th Kamen Rider Den-O movie. As for All Riders vs. Dai Shocker, there's a line Momotaro says where he tells Decade not to call him anymore because he is super busy. Except, he says super busy in a very deliberate way. He uses the word cho. This movie came out in August, and then after we would get Kamen Rider Double and Decade Movie Awards 2010. This brought 2009 up to 3 theatrical films in 1 year, the same amount they had done in 2008. 2007 was the last year to have 2 movies in a single year, and before that, 2006, they only had 1 movie. 2 movies was the exception at this time, and was still very new. But in the year 2010, we would get 5 Kamen Rider movies in 1 year. 1 for Kamen Rider O's and Double, 1 for Kamen Rider Double itself, and 3 for Kamen Rider Cho Den-O. These movies take time, and resources, and crew, and money. The Den-O movies were a money-making powerhouse. These films were making bank, and clearly Toei wanted that money. So in the span of 4 years, they went from releasing a single theatrical movie to 2 movies the next year, to 5 in 1 year. To get to the point that I'm trying to make, I think that Kamen Rider Decade was the lamb set out to pasture, something that had to be cut in order to keep the funds for all these highly lucrative Kamen Rider Den-O movies, and I think Decade was the breaking point. They needed to film all these movies. The Cho Den-O trilogy is over 3 hours worth of film. That's equal to well over 10 episodes of television, and the cost to film these movies is definitely higher than a television show, so I'm quite certain they spent the budget closer to the amount it would have taken to film another 20 episodes of Kamen Rider Decade, and they put that money into their cash cow of Den-O. Now, this is all speculative, and clearly nothing was ever confirmed by the staff or the crew, but to me, it makes the most sense. The exponential growth and expansion of the Kamen Rider film series sprouted up just too fast to keep up with, and something had to give. Decade is just the one most visibly suffered from this. Do I think the show could have been better with a full 50 episodes? Maybe? It would have been nice to actually see AR worlds for Ichigo and Nega, V3, Stronger, Super 1, Sky Rider, and to actually have a proper world for X. It would have been nice to fully flesh out the Dai Shocker threat and have it be given its time to build as a status quo. It would have been nice for DiEnd to actually have a character arc, and for Tsukasa to go through a more developed storyline that shows his actual growth and change as a character. Now, I feel like a lot of these problems and complaints do get addressed in Kamen Rider Go, but since I know that show has a litany of its own issues, I can't say whether it magically fixes everything, but at least being given a full run of episodes has to mean something for its chance of success, right? I think if I had to sum up my feelings, I'm glad I went on this long journey. I got to rewatch Decade with the context of all the other riders. It made seeing earlier Heisei riders fun to see what they did differently in this interpretation, but it also gave me context of the standards and the quality that Decade was following in the footsteps of, and it made it more obvious just how easy it is to make a show that's fun, but also make a show that's not very well put together. I'm never going to hate Decade the way some people do, but I also can't just sit and act like I love it. It just exists to me. Maybe, in a way, it's better that it lives on as a memory to me. Maybe the fun memories of buying the Deca Driver and K-Touch as my first Kamen Rider belts, the memories of the Shinkenger crossover, the memories of Decade fighting Gokai Red and Superhero Tyson, the amazing insert song like Decade's theme, Treasure Sniper, and The Next Decade. Maybe the memories are what Decade is really all about. Because at the end of the day, I could sit and think about a 31 episode series that just fumbles the bag and feels like it's playing catch up with itself, or I can remember everything I find so magical about the series. The things that make me still get excited to see what they do with Decade when I eventually get back to watching Kamen Rider Go later this year. But that's a journey for another day. Thank you so much for watching. I am really happy to have been able to take this experience and be able to turn it into something for you guys to listen along with. Please let me know if you like this format. Please let me know if you want me to do more stuff like this. It certainly makes it easier to get videos out if I can do it a little bit more off the cuff. So let me know what you guys thought. Let me know what your own thoughts about Kamen Rider Decade are. Let me know if you think Go is better or worse than Kamen Rider Decade. Which one do you think is better, Gokaiger or Decade? Do you want me to do... Well, okay, obviously, you guys know we're going to talk about Gokaiger at some point when we get there. But let me know if you want me to talk about it in more detail. And I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.
I call on the power of my Super Mega fans. Super Mega, Jim Bevan.